Owning a gun is not a way of standing up to government tyranny. And people who really emphasize Second Amendment rights sometimes, I think, overemphasize gun ownership and underemphasize all the other ways of responding to government overreach that can and should be used by citizens of a state. And I want to talk a little bit about this, inspired by the fact that I went to a hunting lodge last week with my dad and hung out with folks who were shooting guns and loading guns and building guns and stuff like that. And they were cool folks, and they shared a lot about of their enthusiasm around guns and Second Amendment stuff. And I was talking to them about a podcast that I listen to sometimes called the Second Amendment Report, and how I think it's legally interesting, but that the rhetoric on that podcast is a little bit, in my opinion, over the top. And I could sense as I was talking to these guys that when I mentioned that the rhetoric was a little over the top, I was just like stepping across a boundary with them. And so I didn't push it. I don't want to be like arguing politics at a vacation spot. And these guys, as I say, were quite nice. So I just let it be. But I do think there's something there around the rhetoric of the Second Amendment. And specifically, what I mean is in the Second Amendment Report podcast, and in lots of public discourse around the Second Amendment, there's this constant drumbeat of the idea that gun ownership is a resistance to tyranny. And I guess the notion is that an armed populace will be more difficult to suppress or put down or whatever. And I think there's something to that in at least a sort of hypothetical way, right? Because theoretically, there could be some kind of armed resistance to a tyrannical government. And just the possibility that that could occur perhaps keeps governments in check to an extent. But that's, as I say, it's a hypothetical. And in reality, and here's kind of the crux of the whole thing, in reality, that doesn't happen. In reality, all the gun owners of America, folks with the AR-15s and the shotguns and handguns and whatever, they are not routinely or in fact ever standing up to anything at all that the government is doing by using their firearms. Now, they may do it in other ways, and that's great, but they're not doing anything with their firearms except collecting them, shooting them at targets, and hunting, and buying and selling them, I guess. So look, if I buy a hammer, that doesn't mean I built a cabinet with a hammer. If I buy a whisk, it doesn't mean that I made a souffle with the whisk. All it means is now I have some tools. But if I don't do anything with the tools, if all I do is collect them, I'm not actually creating the thing I think that they're intended for. And similarly with guns, the mere fact that you have a gun or you collect guns or you like guns doesn't do a damn thing to resist tyranny. It just gives you some tools that you don't use. And that's okay. I'm not trying to argue for armed resistance or armed anything at all. I'm just trying to say that merely clinging on to this hypothetical scenario in which tyranny is resisted, but never actually pushing back against the government in reality, is just a mental game that people play with themselves. And it's a way of suggesting that they're going to stand up one day so they don't have to stand up today in reality and actually push back against whatever type of abuse is occurring in the real world. And if you think about it, there are plenty of ways that a government could allow people to bear arms, but nevertheless be quite tyrannical, right? I mean, the government might suppress the right to vote, or the government might crack down on freedom of speech or freedom of religious expression. Government might suppress the right to assemble. All kinds of things can happen that the government can do have nothing to do with the right to bear arms. So the mere fact that an individual has the right to own a gun doesn't mean that the government that permits that ownership is non-tyrannical. So when we think about what resistance to tyranny actually means, as I've said already, one way that tyranny could be resisted, and you can define tyranny however you like, but one way it could be resisted is through, in fact, an actual armed uprising. But we all know, whether we're conservative or liberal, we all know that's likely to be a real Pandora's box, right? Armed, violent, fighting in the street is not something any of us want for the most part, because we all recognize that stability actually has a lot of value, right? And so none of us are actually looking for that. Well, I won't say none, but none of us who are moderately reasonable people, whether we're conservative or liberal, are looking for blood in the streets and, gunfire and all that sort of stuff. So that hypothetical scenario where the guns come in to resist tyranny is not one that any of us are actually looking to see play out in reality. But how else could one resist? Well, there's lots of ways, right? You can vote. You can use your freedom of speech to discuss political issues and to write things and communicate with other people and express your opinions. You can strike. You can go to court. You can talk about it in churches and synagogues and mosques and whatever, and gather with like-minded people, politically organized, and so forth. Just all kinds of tools that we have in a democracy to push back on government overreach. And the thing that mainly I'm struck by is that the Second Amendment community is so excited about cheerleading around this pretty much hypothetical resistance to tyranny via the use of guns or the possession of guns, and pretty much sets aside all this other stuff. You don't hear Ted Nugent talking about how great it is to organize a book group or write op-eds, right? That's not sexy to say, make sure you vote, or don't forget to file an administrative claim and then go to court if the police use excessive force on you. But those are forms of resistance too. In fact, those are the actual forms of resistance that are available to us, right? Not the hypothetical scenario where we all take up arms and resist a tyrannical government, but the actual resistance to actual overreach that really occurs in the real world every day, all the time. It's this kind of stuff, this more mundane stuff that isn't necessarily so great for slapping on the back of your car in a bumper sticker or for raising lots of money, but those are the actual tools of resistance in a democracy. So I say all this just to say nothing wrong with liking guns or being enthusiastic about them or liking the Second Amendment, but let's not forget that hypothetical scenario of resistance to tyranny through the use of arms is something we should hope never occurs. And meanwhile, there are actual tools that we have at our disposal to push back on government overreach in the real world now. All right, thanks guys. Take care.